President Zelensky of Ukraine has, over the last couple of days, visited Washington on his first important trip there as President of Ukraine since he was elected to lead that country back in 2019. This is, by the way, a meeting with the US President that Zelensky has been angling for ever since he became President of Ukraine, and which the United States has repeatedly postponed. Donald Trump wasn't especially keen, apparently, on meeting with Zelensky, and perhaps a little surprisingly, neither was President Biden. In fact, President Biden upset Zelensky considerably back in June when he decided to meet with President Putin of Russia in Geneva before he had met with Zelensky. Anyway, as a result of Ukrainian complaints following that Geneva summit between Biden and Putin, the United States agreed to receive Zelensky in Washington in late August, and Zelensky has eventually come. I would add that because of the debacle in Afghanistan, this visit has been was postponed again at the very last moment, being put back a few days, but nonetheless, no doubt to some extent to Zelensky's relief, it has just taken place. Now, this has been a difficult year for Ukraine. Firstly, we had the situation at the start of this year when President Zelensky was transferring large numbers of troops to the contact line between Ukraine and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And some of the rhetoric that was pouring out of Ukraine at that time, in February and March, made many people think that an offensive of some kind to regain control of the Donbass was being prepared. And as I've discussed in many programs, these events seem to have been coordinated in some fashion with some Western governments which were proposing to send powerful warships into the Black Sea. The United States was intending to send 2 guided missile destroyers into the Black Sea, as were the British. And of course, there seems to have been some kind of correlation to some sort of attempted coup that was attempted in Belarus, which was apparently intended to be staged in the first weeks of May, around the time when this intended or supposed Ukrainian offensive was supposed to take place. Anyway, what happened was that the Russians responded very strongly, both to the Ukrainian build-up and to the language coming out of Kiev, and they carried out a massive build-up of forces on Ukraine's border and made it very clear that if there was a war in eastern Ukraine, Russia would react and Ukraine would be destroyed. And at about the same time, Russian intelligence, working with the Belarusians, seems to have got track of whatever it was that was going on in Belarus. And sure enough, all the people who were apparently engaged in plotting the coup or attempted coup against President Lukashenko of Belarus were rounded up and the coup attempt was squashed. So as a result, the proposal, the intention, if there ever was a serious intention, to launch an attack on the Donbass by the Ukrainian army was also called off, and the United States pulled back, though only temporarily, its guided missile destroyers from the Black Sea as some kind of confidence-building exercise with the Russians. And that was the situation at the end of April and early May. And as I've said at the time, it seemed to me that the very hurriedly convened summit meeting between Biden and Putin in Geneva in June was basically put together by the United States as a kind of safe, face-saving way of pulling back from the crisis in Ukraine that seemed to be brewing up in April. So that, to some extent, left Zelensky himself hanging out to dry. And that has been an important political blow for him. And it's also meant, by the way, that he's had to keep those Ukrainian troops on the contact line ever since then. And apparently there's growing disaffection and demoralization amongst those troops. But he is too politically boxed in to pull them back. At the same time as all that has been happening, the Germans and the Russians have forged ahead with Nord Stream 2. Ukrainian expectations that the United States would impose sanctions to block the completion of Nord Stream 2 were never realized. And the information we now have is that Nord Stream 2 is just days from completion and will start to pump gas before the end of this year. So these have been major blows for Zelensky and for the Ukrainians, and they come at a time when the Ukrainian economy is in a bad way. Ukraine, by the way, is now the poorest country in Europe, and as a Ukrainian politician, Viktor Medvedchuk has pointed out, Ukraine is the only former republic of the Soviet Union whose economy has still not recovered to the levels that it had when the Soviet Union broke up. Ukraine is still poorer than it was then. And that is an extraordinary fact, and it shows the extent to which Ukraine's statehood up to now has failed to achieve the many optimistic predictions made of it at the time when the Soviet Union itself broke up. So we have an economic crisis, we have a social crisis, we have a political crisis, and we have, on the part of Zelensky, a president whose position is becoming increasingly insecure, whose popularity in Ukraine has been falling, and who, by the way, has tried to respond to all this political pressure upon him by cracking down hard on the opposition, many of whose leaders he has either sanctioned or, in the case of Medvedchuk, brought prosecutions against, and who has been busy closing down opposition television and radio stations and closing down opposition websites in order to try to buttress his control. So a weakened Zelensky, a discomfited Zelensky, coming to meet in Washington a Biden who has been also weakened by the effect of the Afghanistan debacle. And of course, Biden himself perhaps has added personal reasons, which I'm not going to discuss in any detail, for not wanting to get too close to the Ukrainian situation, which has proved in the past embarrassing for him and which might prove embarrassing again in the future. So what do we get as a result, therefore, of this summit meeting? Well, we get more resounding words of support for Ukraine from the United States. But then, of course, we previously had resounding words of support for Afghanistan from the United States, and those amounted to very little. And those of us with long memories will remember that once upon a time there were similar resounding words of support for South Vietnam, and those didn't amount to very much either. So all these resounding words of support perhaps don't mean very much. And we have had further words of support from the United States backing Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, but perhaps we shouldn't take those entirely seriously either, because notably absent from the joint statement that Ukraine and the United States have published over the course of Zelensky's meeting is any commitment on the part of the United States to support Ukraine's membership of NATO by any near or foreseeable date. Instead, what we get instead are endless and detailed demands that Ukraine should carry out all sorts of unspecified reforms to enable itself to become a fit and proper member one day to join NATO and presumably the European Union at some endlessly postponed date into the far future. And of course, we also get from the United States all sorts of pledges of economic assistance. But again, if one goes into the detail, these pledges of economic assistance all seem to look extremely vague. They don't really seem to come down to any definite figures and anything one can actually rely upon. There's talk about the United States and Ukraine cooperating on science and technology, on economics and on trade, but nothing really very concrete. In fact, the only concrete sum that the United States seems to be pledging is the derisory one of $60 million, which is to be provided to Ukraine in terms of help for Ukraine's defense, and which Ukraine is expected to spend on American weapons, principally, it seems, Javelin anti-tank guided missiles. Now, one takes a step back and thinks about what that means. It means that the United States, with one hand, is giving Ukraine money, which Ukraine is going to have to spend buying arms from American corporations in the military-industrial sector. In other words, it's a nice way for the United States to give still more money to the military-industrial complex, but doing so this time through a foreign middleman. I'm sure that's not quite how the United States rationalizes the matter to itself, but frankly, that's how it rather looks. And I would add, and on top of all of that, that of course $60 million is a derisory amount of money. Contrast that with the tens upon tens of billions that the United States spent on the Afghan military, which has just collapsed. In fact, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has said rather sardonically that the Afghan military was equipped by the United States to a far higher level than the Ukrainian military currently is. Well, that may be true or it may be not. It may just be Shoigu's little joke. I personally doubt that the Ukrainian military is as ineffectual as the Afghan military has turned out to be. But then again, you never know. And last but not least, there is, of course, Nord Stream 2. And the United States has again said to Zelensky that they will impose sanctions on Russia if the Russians stop pumping gas across Ukraine after the completion of Nord Stream 2. Now, I have to say that has always made absolutely no sense to me. Why should the United States oblige Russia to pump gas through Ukraine if the Russians don't want to do that? It seems to me that this is the United States trying to dictate to Russia its commercial and economic policy. And I predict, by the way, that there's going to be problems with all of that before very long, because the Russians are now cooling to the idea of continuing to use Ukraine as a gas transit state. Putin made certain comments recently which suggested that he is skeptical about whether there will indeed be a gas transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine after 2024. And of course, if the United States then does impose or try to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 to prevent that pipeline operating, then I suspect that's going to create many problems in Germany, which the Americans might find very difficult to explain or justify. But anyway, there we are. this threat of sanctions against Nord Stream 2 has been made by the United States before, and it has proved ineffectual. And I have to say, I do wonder whether it is it is going to be any more effective in the future. But regardless, the comments made over the course of this meeting merely recycle things that have already been said previously. And that, I have to say, is the entire nature of the two documents and of all the statements that have appeared as a result of this meeting. The joint statement between Ukraine and the United States, and the other document, the readout of the preliminary comments Biden and Zelensky made to each other when they met. It's all the same things that have been said previously, pledges that have been made previously, commitments that have been made previously, nothing actually that is new, all of it the same as before, and all of it, I suspect, as empty and hollow as it was before. Now, what actually is going to happen in the future? I'm going to make here a historical parallel, and it's one that I want to stress is one that makes certain assumptions about the future which may not be realized. I'm not pushing this too far, but let's look at two countries that the United States did back in recent years, or at least in the last few decades: South Vietnam and Afghanistan. In both cases, the United States backed a government that came to power through controversial means. And in both cases, that government, as a result, lacked legitimacy and a critical mass of support on the part of many of the people that it purported to govern. In both cases, in South Vietnam and in Afghanistan, the government resorted to corruption in order to try to hold the country together and to maintain support within that country. But in doing so, it only made its own political system even more dysfunctional, and of course it undermined still further the support it had amongst the people. And in both countries, the United States tried to make up the difference by pouring in economic aid and by making endless demands of both governments for reforms and for an end of corruption, which in both cases went unheeded. On the contrary, the more American aid went in, the worse the corruption became. And as several people, by the way, commented on threads to my previous programs when I discussed this issue, in both cases, unfortunately, you had people from the United States and from Europe and from elsewhere going to these countries and in order to try and benefit from the corruption that was taking place there. And eventually, when the United States began to tire of its commitment, unending commitment to these two countries, which was becoming inordinately expensive and clearly hopeless, the governments of those countries responded not by starting to take conciliatory moves towards the other side, not by engaging the other side in negotiations, not by making a sincere and serious attempt to end the war, but by taking an ever more hardline position, insisting that they would go on and hold out indefinitely and to the end, and making confident predictions that they would be able to continue without the United States. And in the case of both South Vietnam and Afghanistan, which, like Ukraine today, are not in full control of all their territory and which have domestic insurgencies under arms in both their countries, well, what eventually happened in the case of South Vietnam and Afghanistan was that the government and all its complicated apparatus and structure eventually collapsed when the United States left, and the leaders of the governments of both of those countries went into exile, with a lot of the people who had supported them also when things began to fall apart, making hurriedly for the exits. Well, is that the future of Ukraine? I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody can ever say for sure, but it does seem to me that some of the parallels are there. The government, the present government of Ukraine, like the governments of Afghanistan and South Vietnam, came to power in, shall we say, a controversial way, as is the case in Afghanistan and South Vietnam. It has never obtained full acceptance amongst all the people of Ukraine, and of course some people in Ukraine have taken up arms against it, and the government has never proved able to defeat them. And as is the case in Afghanistan and South Vietnam, corruption has taken hold in Ukraine as it becomes, one senses, a factor binding the government together and enabling the system to function, if only in some way. And the government in Ukraine, just as the governments in South Vietnam and Afghanistan, refuses at the same time to negotiate or compromise with the other side, even when, as was also the case, by the way, from time to time in South Vietnam and in Afghanistan, it is legally and treaty bound committed to doing so. Now, will the situation in Ukraine collapse in the same way that it did in South Vietnam and Afghanistan? Well, the short answer is I don't know, and history doesn't always repeat itself, but it sometimes does, and as somebody once elegantly said, it often rhymes. But if you want to predict, or you expect, or you think that such an outcome in Ukraine is indeed possible, then it seems to me that the events of the last year, of this year, might turn out to be stages in that direction. And as for the latest summit meeting between Zelensky and Biden, that is simply a punctuation mark in this process. My guess is that despite all the brave talk, before long, the United States will indeed wash its hands of Ukraine. Ukraine has become an embarrassment. It was, if you like, a regime change too far. It's too embedded in the former Soviet and Russian system. It's too close to Russia, and the Russians have too much influence and sway there for whatever project was hatched way back in 2013, 2014, ever to be, in the end, successful. And in the end, sooner or later, just as with Afghanistan and just as with South Vietnam, the United States will conclude that its greater interests are served by pulling out from there. Now, what sort of Ukrainian state might survive, whether that state will continue to be led by a government that has any connection to this one, the existing one, when that point is reached, well, that remains to be seen. But so far as I can see, these commitments, so-called commitments, made by the United States over the course of this summit meeting between Zelensky and Biden, leave the US's, or all of the US's options fully open, and suggest that already there are people in Washington who are quietly looking for a way to close down the whole affair. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to look up Alex's channel. You find links under this video. And then, of course, please also come to our other platforms. Locals first and foremost, where we have a thriving community and which has been given a tremendous boost over the course of the last couple of days, as you have all of you rallied to our support following that extraordinary decision taken last week by PayPal, which I confess still angers and distresses me, and which I have discussed previously and on our main channel. But also, as well as locals, which I do urge you to join, and where I'm now active, I'm actively involved making other videos and doing making other comments, and where I will very shortly be doing live streams, the technology now having been perfected to do them. Please, as I said, do join us at Locals, but there's also our other platforms, Super U, the new free speech platform, where we're also becoming very active, but also BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, and of course Rumble. I understand Rumble and Locals have linked up together in some way, and that is an extremely impressive development. And also, of course, if you want to support us, you please do by coming to Patreon and Subscribestar. And also don't forget to go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there, our superb magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me today for this video. I hope you will join me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.